The chandeliers burned gold above a ballroom full of silk, diamonds, and loaded smiles. Music floated through the air, glasses touched, laughter rose like smoke, and in the center of it all stood Cale Thornton, still, polished, untouchable. Then a voice drifted from behind a service door, soft, familiar, impossible. He turned, and there she was, the woman he had lost, thinner than memory, wearier than regret, and carrying a child close to birth. In that instant, the music died, the room disappeared, and all that remained was the sound of a heart realizing it had never truly moved on.
Tonight, the Meridian Grand has been transformed into a gilded fortress. Amidst the shimmer of crystal and the gleam of marble, a state of unspoken siege is in effect. Here, the city's elite navigate a landscape of opulent floral displays and silver-laden tables. A cool jazz melody provides a deceptive calm as champagne and whiskey circulate, but this is no ordinary gala. The space is patrolled by sentinels in dark suits, their gazes sweeping every corner, their jackets concealing the cold reality of their function. Surveillance is omnipresent and absolute. Here, a handshake is not a greeting, but a sacrament of allegiance. This is, after all, the engagement celebration for Cale Thornton, the sovereign of the East Coast's underworld. At 37, he transmuted a criminal network into a quasi-legitimate corporate empire stretching from New York to Miami. This evening is meant to herald a new dynasty through his union with Priscilla Hargrove, the sole heir of Southern Syndicate leader Raymond Hargrove. This is not a matter of romance, but a strategic merger of America's two most powerful criminal enterprises, witnessed by a cabal of figures who exist only in shadow. They congregate in the main hall, where electronics are forbidden, yet every eye functions as a lens, recording each nuance. A performance of smiles and toasts unfolds, a theater in which Cale alone refuses to participate, his glass remaining untouched for the entire hour. His formidable presence commands a vacuum of silence. His chiseled features betray no emotion, but his chilling gray eyes, the very source of fear in his world, are utterly desolate. He is an apparition at his own coronation. Priscilla stands beside him, a vision in a crimson gown adorned with a fortune in diamonds. Her smile is perfected, her appearance flawless, her hand possessively fixed to Cale's arm, a public declaration of ownership. She leans close, her smile unwavering, and murmurs, "One would think you were attending a funeral, not your own engagement." A faint, arctic smile touches Cale's lips. "I am fine." The words are shards of ice, a coldness she either fails to perceive or chooses to disregard. She is, it seems, electing to ignore it, turning away to redeploy her impeccable smile. Poised and powerful, she is the archetypal queen for the Thornton dynasty, the wife deemed appropriate for a man of his station. Yet Cale understands the reality. The woman beside him is a living contract, clad in red. He surveys the room of supplicants and sycophants, all of them orbiting his gravity, desperate for his favor or terrified of his wrath. Everyone covets a piece of his dominion. He should be at the apex of his world. Yet just 2 years ago, his existence was the antithesis of this, defined not by power, but by peril, and the one person who saw him for what he was. A memory he labors to entomb daily, but memory is a predator that strikes in moments of quiet. Cale's eyes fly open. The grand ballroom suddenly feels constrictive, its gilded walls closing in. He moves toward the balcony, his lieutenant, Sterling, trailing 3 paces behind, ever the shadow. He emerges into the biting Manhattan night, the city sprawling below as a constellation of conquered lights. He stands in silent contemplation for a moment before turning back to re-enter the heart of the machine. Traversing the corridor, he notices a service door left ajar. A clatter of dishware, and then a voice cuts through the ambient noise. "I can handle that tray. Go and take a rest." In that instant, Cale is frozen mid-stride. His sensory world collapses. The music, the chatter, the clinking of glasses all evaporate. there is only the sound of that voice, gentle yet frayed at the edges, the same one that had been his anchor as his former life was consumed by flames. "We will get through this." The memory is a lightning strike. His heart seizes, a single violent beat, then stillness. He approaches the door, peering through the narrow opening into a chaotic kitchen, a maelstrom of activity. And there, at its center, he sees her, Meadow. She is hoisting a heavy tray of flutes, dressed in a simple server's uniform. She appears thinner, marked by fatigue. The warmth he remembered in her eyes is now buried beneath layers of exhaustion. The intervening years have clearly taken their toll. Yet it is undeniably her. The characteristic tilt of her head, the weary smile she offers a coworker, it is the same Meadow who once looked past the monster in a quiet Brooklyn bookstore. Then she turns, and Cale's entire constructed reality implodes. Her abdomen is profoundly swollen. She is heavily pregnant. The glass in his hand spiders with cracks, but the sound is lost, the roaring in his ears. He is unmoored. The gala, the city, the world itself ceases to exist. The only reality is the frantic drumming of his heart against his ribs. Meadow had vanished from his life 9 months ago without a word, without a trace, simply ceasing to be. And now she stands before him, a server at his engagement on the verge of giving birth. 9 months. The number is a physical blow. 9 months of absence, 9 months of gestation. The calculus is a perfect glacial nightmare. His mind fractures into 1,000 questions. Another man? A husband? Whose child? One thought rises above the chaos to obliterate all others. It is his. Cale remains paralyzed, watching as Meadow works, oblivious to the fact that the ghost of her past is her silent observer. Sterling halts behind him, his gaze following Cale's to its target. He understands immediately. The secret he has guarded for 5 months has just been violently exposed by a cruel twist of fate. Cale turns, his gray eyes now burning with the terrifying light that transcends mere anger. Sterling remains outwardly still, bracing for the inevitable collision. He knows the question that is coming and knows its answer will detonate the foundations of their world. In this corridor, the past has just collided with the present at terminal velocity. A 5-month conspiracy now lies in ruins, and a storm of unprecedented magnitude is gathering over the Thornton Empire. Cale's next move is poised to irrevocably alter the course of every life he touches. As he faces Sterling, the very air grows thick with consequence. The Kingpin's eyes are no longer cold. They are furnaces, ignited by something deeper and more primal than rage. An expression Sterling has never witnessed in 12 years. There is no shout, no show of force. Just a single sentence uttered in a whisper that could fracture stone. Each word is an indictment. She is here. It is not a question but a verdict, and Sterling simply stands his ground. He does not avert his gaze or offer an excuse. He gives one slow, deliberate nod, a silent confession. The hallway is enveloped in a deafening silence. Beyond the door, the oblivious celebration continues, a separate reality of music and laughter. But in this corridor, the air is a suffocating weight. Cale's stare is fixed on Sterling, unwavering and absolute. For 12 years, Sterling had been his unwavering shadow through wars and exile in a world where survival was dictated by a single glance. 12 years of fealty incinerated in an instant. The questions burn within Cale. For how long? And the most corrosive of all, why? He is consumed by the need to ask if Sterling knew of the child, if he knew its parentage, to ask if Meadow had any idea that he spent his nights pacing an empty mansion, tormented by the possibility of her death. He wants to give voice to every wound. But he cannot, not in this place. The most powerful figures in the country are mere feet away. So Cale suppresses the inferno of rage and betrayal, containing a cataclysm through sheer force of will. When he speaks, his voice is unnervingly serene. Secure the service entrance. Total lockdown. Nothing and no one gets in or out. Sterling offers another single nod without question or protest. He understands that retribution has only been deferred. His sole duty now is to obey and pray the fallout is survivable. Cale pivots and walks away. His steps on the marble floor were a masterwork of control, each one measured and even, belying the seismic fracturing of his inner world. He pushed open the ballroom doors, and a wave of light and sound washed over him. Hundreds of ignorant, smiling faces turned toward him. Near the stage, Priscilla was charming a senator's wife. The moment she registered his presence, she turned, offering a perfect smile as she extended her hand. Cale moved to her side, his hand resting on her back in the practiced gesture of a power couple. He lifted his glass. "Thank you for coming." The vocal tone was flawless. The smile, even more so. The performance was impeccable, save for one detail, the utter void in his eyes. It was an emptiness visible only to someone who knew the landscape of his soul. Priscilla either did not notice or chose to dismiss it. She continued her role as the ideal fiancée to the East Coast's most formidable man. But Cale was no longer there. His body stood in the glittering hall, holding a glass of whiskey beside the woman he was to marry. But his mind was trapped in a service corridor with a slight woman in a drab uniform, her hands chapped from work, her body carrying a child that was almost certainly his. He raised the glass to his lips. This time, he drank. He felt the whiskey's burn descend, a futile attempt to cauterize the corrosion within. But no spirit was strong enough. Nothing could erase the image of Meadow, gaunt, exhausted, and bearing a secret life he had unknowingly helped create. 8 months. The number twisted in his gut like a viper. Against his will, the past rushed forward to claim him. He was pulled back to a Brooklyn afternoon, to a small bookstore, to the sound of her laughter as he fumbled with a stack of books, and to the moment their world detonated. 2 years prior, on a crisp October afternoon, Cale Thornton stepped across the threshold of a small bookshop nestled on a serene Brooklyn street. The chime of a small bell announced his arrival into a space that smelled of aged paper and pine, where soft light illuminated shelves reaching toward the ceiling. Here, the familiar architecture of his world, surveillance cameras, armed sentinels, the averted gazes of subordinates, was absent. Only books, silence, and a young woman at the counter, lost in a narrative. Cale was pursuing a 1925 first edition of The Great Gatsby, a clandestine passion unknown to the criminal underworld. The irony was stark. The East Coast's most formidable figure was a bibliophile. A rival discovering this vulnerability would use it as a final, mocking jest before the kill. Yet in this haven he was not a kingpin, but merely a patron. As the bell rang, the woman glanced up. Her light brown hair formed a soft halo around her shoulders. Her gaze was warm and inquisitive, entirely devoid of fear. She wore an oversized cream sweater, its sleeves pushed to her elbows, and her smile was so authentic it momentarily erased the memory of the ruin he had just commanded. "Good afternoon," she offered. "Are you seeking something specific or simply exploring?" Cale paused, truly seeing her before answering quietly. "First edition Fitzgerald." She gestured left. "The rare collection is that way." He perused the indicated shelves, but the search proved fruitless. He scanned the adjacent row and then the next. From the counter, her voice, laced with amusement, drifted over. "That's romance. You're in the wrong section, unless you're after the special edition Gatsby penned for his lover." Cale turned slowly, meeting her gaze. When had anyone last dared to jest with him? The memory did not exist. His life was a sterile landscape of fear, sycophancy, and conspiracy. No one teased him. No one met his gaze with such disarming honesty, as if he were simply a man adrift amongst the stacks. But this young woman did. And instead of rage, Cale felt the ghost of a smile touch his lips. For the first time in an age, she emerged from behind the counter, guided him to the correct location, and produced a book wrapped in paper. Not a first, but a 1934 printing in excellent condition. He accepted the volume, turning its pages with reverence. The paper was aged and yellowed, the ink a 90-year-old testament. She observed his careful touch, a tenderness typically reserved for the most delicate of artifacts. "Are you an avid reader?" she finally inquired. "When I can find the time." "What is your favorite?" The question's simplicity was disarming. In his entire existence, such a personal query had never been posed. He hesitated. "East of Eden." Her smile widened. "Steinbeck, a fine choice." And so it began, not with a cataclysm, but with two people discussing literature as dusk fell. Yet when Cale departed, book in hand, her smile was an indelible imprint on his mind. He returned the following day, and the next, and again the subsequent week. He always fabricated a pretense, a search for one book, an inquiry about another. But both understood the books were not the true objective. He learned her name on his third visit, Meadow. She never probed into his profession. To her, he was simply KL, a man who cherished old books, took his coffee black, and tilted his head in thought. This was all that mattered. And there, amidst the quiet shelves, a friendship began to bloom. They spoke of literature, of existence, of how the afternoon light filtered through the dusty panes. Meadow shared her history, orphaned young, raised by her grandmother, independent since 18. She recounted it with a quiet grace, devoid of bitterness, as if her pain were a neatly archived memory. Listening, Cale perceived that this woman, with only a rented shop and a small fifth-floor apartment, possessed a serenity he had never known. Soon their bond deepened into something more. The precise moment of transformation was elusive. Perhaps it was the night she stayed late, reading her favorite passage aloud just for him. Her voice was a warm current in the silent shop, her face illuminated by the lamplight. In that instant, Cale knew he could listen to that sound for the remainder of his life. But he kept his world shrouded. She knew only KL, the businessman, not KL Thornton, whose empire was founded on violence and deceit. He concealed his life out of a profound terror, fear that the truth would curdle her warm gaze into horror, shattering the only authentic thing he possessed. But secrets have a tendency to surface. One evening, walking her home from a small restaurant, Cale sensed they were being shadowed. 3 figures moved with predatory grace, maintaining a perfect, menacing distance. They were Vasquez's men, old adversaries probing for a weakness in Cale Thornton's defenses, and they had just located it. The event unfolded in an instant. Sterling materialized from the darkness. 3 muted reports echoed and 3 forms collapsed. Meadow stood frozen, her eyes wide, her back against the abrasive brick. She stared at Sterling, at the weapon still exhaling a thin trail of smoke. Then her gaze locked with Cale's, and he witnessed his deepest fear manifest. Not terror, but a horrifying clarity. The truth had finally coalesced. She now understood he was something far more lethal. For 3 days following that night, only silence reigned. Meadow ignored his calls. The bookshop remained shuttered. His messages went unanswered. For 3 days, Cale stood outside the store, observing the closed sign. And the East Coast's most feared man felt a cold dread no enemy had ever induced. The terror of losing someone. Then, on the 4th day, his phone vibrated. It was Meadow. Her voice was soft and slightly unsteady, yet resolute. "I love the man that you are, Cale. Not the name, not that other world, just you." Cale stood motionless in his office, phone to his ear. In that moment, he resolved to make her his wife, regardless of the cost. Cale and Meadow were married on a tranquil Saturday afternoon at Brooklyn City Hall. There was no grand ballroom, no throng of guests, no elaborate orchestra, no expensive champagne. It was simply the two of them, a judge and Sterling as their witness. Meadow wore a plain white dress from a second-hand store, her hair falling on her shoulders, clutching a small bouquet Cale purchased from a street vendor. Her smile was so brilliant, Cale was certain he had never witnessed anything more beautiful. He placed a simple silver band on her finger. No diamonds, no gold, just a ring he could afford now that his empire had vanished. And to him, it was flawless. But the cost for that perfect moment arrived sooner than they imagined. News of the wedding permeated the underworld in under 48 hours. Brantley Thornton summoned his son to the family estate a final time. The meeting concluded in fewer than 5 minutes. Cale entered to find his father behind a vast desk, his expression like chiseled ice. He did not yell. He did not strike the table. He uttered only 4 words. "You are erased from the Mafia world." Being disowned by his father was no mere family quarrel. It was not the loss of credit privileges. It signified the forfeiture of everything. The territory Cale once governed was reallocated overnight. His 20-person security detail simply vanished. His bank accounts were frozen solid. Allies who once swore loyalty now ghosted him with palpable speed. Worse, Raymond Hargrove took the broken engagement to Priscilla as a grave insult. He was not a forgiving man. Within a week, the first threat was delivered, so the old man's opening salvo was not a call or a letter. It was a message in blood. Cale and Meadow were secreted away in a tiny third-floor walk-up in Queens with creaking floors. They returned late one night to find the door ajar, yet inside, nothing appeared disturbed. But scrawled across their bed in crimson were the words, "No father, no anything." Meadow froze completely, her gaze fixed on the wall. Cale saw her hands begin to tremble like a leaf, but she fought to conceal it, clutching her shirt. Yet she did not weep, nor scream, nor ask a single question. She simply turned to him, her voice steady despite her brimming eyes, and spoke her mantra, "We are going to be okay." They fled that night for a smaller, grimmer place. Cale tried to rebuild, but in his world, having no family meant having no support whatsoever. Every venture he attempted to organize was systematically dismantled. His father's influence extinguished every connection he forged. The funds depleted as the danger escalated. Cale accepted dubious jobs for ruthless men, selling pieces of himself to pay the rent, and that is when he began to fracture. Meadow perceived the transformation more clearly than anyone. The man who had charmed her in the bookstore was vanishing, replaced by one who never smiled. His eyes carried a permanent shadow from sleepless nights and grim necessities he never shared. He would return later and later, sometimes with bruised knuckles, sometimes smelling of cordite. He remained silent. She never inquired, but the truth was an unspoken specter between them. Meadow began to confront a terrifying question. Would any of this have transpired if not for her? The answer was an unyielding, brutal no. Without her, he would remain a prince in his father's kingdom, an army at his disposal. His destiny was to marry Priscilla Hargrove, merging two powerful bloodlines to become the nation's most formidable crime lord. Instead, he languished in obscurity with a bookstore clerk, brokering deadly pacts simply to endure. The fault, he concluded, was entirely hers. That conviction was not a mere thought. It was an invasive entity that colonized her mind. It greeted her each morning in the hollows under Cale's eyes and haunted her when he returned at night, a colder version of himself. It was a phantom whisper as he slept, confirming her deepest fear. She was the agent of his destruction. She was the anchor dragging him down, the singular reason his world had been reduced to ashes. This toxic idea metastasized within her daily. That night, she discovered Cale slumped at the desk in their cramped apartment, his head beside a testament to their failure. A power disconnection notice, an eviction warning, a debt marker from a failed bargain. His right hand was a ruin of bruised and bloodied knuckles. His afternoon mediation had concluded not with a handshake, but with violence. A tactical victory for Cale that yielded only a new enemy and a fresh threat. Meadow remained still, a silent observer of his sleep. The profound quiet of the apartment amplified his ragged breathing and the relentless clock. Under the lamp's faint glow, his face momentarily reverted to the boy she first met among the shelves, a ghost from before the fall. But the fresh gash on his hand was a brutal reminder that the Cale of the past was rapidly eroding. Tears traced paths down Meadow's cheeks, unheeded. She reached out, her palm resting gently against his face. His skin was warm, his sleep undisturbed. She held the pose for an eternity, attempting to sear the sensation into her memory, intuiting this would be the final time. The plan had been crystallizing for weeks. Seeing him awash in debt and violence made it immutable. Her love for him was potent enough to compel her toward the one act that would utterly destroy her, granting him his freedom. Meadow withdrew her hand. She took up a sheet of paper to compose a farewell, but no words could adequately frame her impending action. Ultimately, she inscribed a single sentence: "You were meant for more than this. Do not follow me." She placed the note atop the pile of bills where he would surely see it. Then she took a small, pre-packed bag containing clothes, some cash, and the book he had given her. She paused at the threshold, taking one final inventory of his sleeping form. An instinct screamed at her to return, to beg his forgiveness. But she understood that if he awoke, her resolve would shatter. So she turned, slipped through the door, and vanished into the night. Cale awoke at his desk the following morning, a sharp pain searing his neck. He scanned the unnervingly silent apartment. The stillness was wrong. He called her name, receiving only silence as a reply. He bolted upright, searching each room with rising panic. All were vacant. Then his eyes fell upon the note. He absorbed the words, "You deserve a better life." She believed herself the contagion and her departure the antidote. Less than 3 minutes later, Cale was on the line with Sterling. His directive was stark: locate Meadow. Mobilize every asset, spared no resource. The first week yielded nothing. A month passed with no new intelligence. Cale became a specter, sustained only by calls that delivered successive waves of failure. Then, in a twist of fate, his most loyal man, Sterling, found her in the 3rd month. He identified Meadow in a Bronx cafe, weary but alive, and made the decision to betray his master. In Cale's world, she had effectively ceased to be, erased from existence. the search was eventually called off, not from acceptance, but because the accumulating grief threatened to consume him entirely. He placed a single call to his father. Brantley Thornton listened, then issued one command: "Come home." So Cale returned, capitulating to every one of his father's terms. The engagement to Priscilla Hargrove was revived. The alliance between the two families was thus solidified. Within a year, he had forged the Thornton Empire into a leviathan more vast and savage than his father had ever conceived. He became the specter whispered about on the East Coast, clinical, precise, and utterly lethal. Yet concealed within his desk lay a small velvet box holding the inexpensive silver ring he once placed on Meadow's finger. It was the sole relic of that life he could not discard. Now Priscilla Hargrove was no one's ingenue. Raised under Raymond Hargrove, her family dinners were lessons in silent warfare. She could deconstruct a man's tells before she could decipher a novel. And on this night, Cale was an open book. For the past 30 minutes, since returning from the hallway, the fissures in his composure had been apparent. His smile was a carefully constructed facade, but his eyes were fractured. His voice was controlled, yet his respiration was flawed. He clutched his whiskey glass with bone-white knuckles, his gaze fixed on the service entrance. He was a marionette whose strings had been pulled taut. She had also registered the brief, strained exchange between Cale and Sterling earlier. It was fleeting, but Sterling's expression was one of pure crisis management. She did not know the catalyst, but she recognized a problem, and Priscilla Hargrove did not permit problems to fester. Excusing herself, she navigated to the service entrance and peered through a gap in the door. Amid the chaotic dance of the staff, a single figure arrested her attention. A young woman in a server's uniform, her hair neatly braided, held a tray. Her state of advanced pregnancy was undeniable. Priscilla's expression hardened. She had never met Meadow, but she knew Cale's psychology. A pregnant server appearing on his engagement night, capable of unnerving him so profoundly. This was no accident. Priscilla did not engage in questions or create a scene. As the Southern mob's scion, her methods were surgical and discreet. She retrieved her phone and summoned the hotel manager to a secluded corner. A man in a gray suit approached, his fear palpable. "One of your servers is pregnant," Priscilla stated, her voice like silk, her intent like a stiletto. "For a secure event of this caliber, that is a liability. Remove her immediately." The manager offered a subservient nod, a pawn in her game. While Priscilla orchestrated events from afar, Meadow was enduring a psychological onslaught. Her shift had begun with a visceral shock, a banner announcing the engagement of Cale Thornton and Priscilla Hargrove. In that instant, her carefully constructed world fractured. A primal urge to flee seized her, but the $120 from this job represented a significant portion of her next ultrasound payment. She was, quite literally, too destitute to escape her own tragedy. So she lowered her head and worked the party from hell. Meadow fixed her gaze on soiled glasses and empty tables. Anything to avoid the main stage. Yet for a single, fatal second, she glanced through a door and saw him. Cale, the gravitational center of this universe, the very picture of a Mafia CEO in his tuxedo, his face a sculpture of sharp planes. The nation's top 1% orbited him as if he were their sovereign. This was not the man for their tiny apartment, defeated by eviction notices. This iteration of Cale was a titan, a force of nature. He had become precisely who he was always meant to be. And against all reason, Meadow smiled. It was a fleeting expression, a composite of heartbreak and pride. "You did it," she whispered, a secret confession for her and her unborn child. She turned away quickly before he could meet her gaze, melting back into the anonymous duties of the service staff. But 15 minutes later, the manager materialized at her side. "Miss Sinclair, you're relieved," he announced, his tone devoid of warmth. "Protocol dictates pregnant staff are a liability at A-list functions." Meadow met his gaze. "I am scheduled until midnight." "The decision came from the top." "Now, retrieve your belongings and depart." "And my compensation for the evening?" The manager developed a sudden, intense interest in the floor. "That is currently under review." The unspoken dismissal was absolute. Meadow understood the power dynamic. People like her did not make demands. She simply removed her apron and folded it. She collected her small bag from a locker, where 2 guards were now stationed by the rear exit. They escorted her out not as a worker, but as a potential threat, an 8 months pregnant woman who had worked for 3 hours. The heavy door boomed shut, finalizing her expulsion. Meadow stood on the pavement as the Manhattan night air bit at her skin. The wind cut through her thin coat. One hand instinctively cradled her abdomen, her bag on her shoulder. The walkway was desolate, cast in the jaundiced glow of street lamps. She looked toward the dark sky, inhaled, and began to walk, utterly alone, just as she had been through the most harrowing chapter of her life. Cale, in her absence, endured exactly 15 minutes after tasking Sterling with watching the service door. For 15 minutes, he performed his role, smiling and mingling while his spirit burned. Then, his composure broke. He abandoned his drink, offered Priscilla a pretext about a security detail with Sterling, and moved directly toward the service hall. Priscilla registered his departure. Her smile never faltered, but her eyes narrowed imperceptibly. She knew. Cale thrust the service door open. Inside, the staff moved with frantic energy. His eyes swept the area. Once, twice, no sign of Meadow. He intercepted a passing server. "The pregnant waitress, brown hair, where is she?" The man, sensing the authority in his tone, lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "They sent her home, sir, about 20 minutes ago." Cale's jaw clenched. "On whose order?" The server's terrified gaze, fixed on his own shoes, was all the confession required. Cale did not need to ask again. He pivoted, his glare like a laser burning through the door to where Priscilla stood smiling. Then, as if feeling his stare, Priscilla turned and met his eyes. The smile remained, but her gaze issued a cold challenge, a silent transmission. "I know who you were searching for, and I have already dealt with her." The message was unmistakable. Cale turned to Sterling, who stood waiting. The question required no antecedent. Sterling, understanding the singular obsession, consulted his device. The response was immediate, clinical. "Bus stop, rear of the hotel, approximately 100 meters." Cale offered no acknowledgement. He simply moved, a projectile of purpose, breaching the fire escape and consumed by the darkness. Manhattan's October air met him with a percussive force. His breath ghosted the jaundiced glow of the streetlights. The alley, a vacuum of human presence, offered only the scent of urban decay and a low metropolitan thrum. His footsteps provided the scene's only rhythm, a staccato on the wet pavement. Then, rounding the corner, the abstract became concrete. Meadow was a tableau of vulnerability, a shape folded against the elements. Her coat was a flimsy defense against the wind's assault. Her hands formed a protective shield over the life she carried, her gaze fixed on the ground in a state of profound fatigue. At a distance of 5 paces, his forward momentum ceased. His heart became a frantic engine against his ribs, a sound he felt could bridge the space between them. The 8-month void, A period defined by absence and phantom pursuits collapsed into this single, stark image. The ghost made flesh 100 meters from his world of success. The cadence of his approach compelled her to look up. Recognition detonated in her eyes, pupils dilating. A primal protective instinct propelled her to her feet, one hand instinctively guarding her womb as she retreated. His name, spoken into the wind, was less a word than an exhalation of disbelief. Her features were sculpted by hardship, cheekbones sharpened, and eyes shadowed with exhaustion. Yet they were the same warm eyes that had once dismantled his defenses in a Brooklyn bookstore. His focus then shifted, drawn by an undeniable gravity, to the swell of her abdomen. It was a profound, unignorable truth. A spasm of tension seized his jaw. The ensuing silence was not empty, but substantive. A palpable barrier built from 8 months of unanswered questions. When Cale finally spoke, his voice was a tightly controlled tremor, each word saturated with the weight of his long vigil. "Whose is it?" Her gaze fled his, seeking refuge at the vacant street, in the transient light of passing cars, anything to escape the inferno of his scrutiny. She had rehearsed this confrontation, anticipated this precise question. The manufactured answer was ready. "Not yours." The delivery of the lie was a minor triumph of will over terror. Yet her body betrayed her. A hand instinctively tightened over her child, a subconscious confession that Cale immediately decoded. His survival was predicated on deciphering such tells, and with Meadow, her deceptions were transparent. Her averted gaze, the bloodless clench of her fingers, the brittle intake of her next breath, all signs pointed to falsehood. He registered the lie but chose to let it hang in the air. A sudden, visceral pain then rippled through her, forcing a flinch and a sharp, audible gasp as her body asserted its own urgent narrative. The mask of composure slipped, revealing a flicker of raw agony that Cale did not miss. His perception widened, absorbing the full context of her desperation. The tattered shoes, the inadequate coat against the city's autumn chill, the chafed hands, and the prominent curve of her belly beneath a stark uniform. It was a uniform she still wore, a symbol of a life interrupted. Here was the brutal calculus of her situation. Imminent childbirth, exposed to the cold at 11 p.m., jobless and deprived of her earnings. In an instant, the edifice of his anger crumbled, replaced by a more fundamental, possessive drive. His tone softened. "Get in the car." Meadow regarded him, offering a defiant claim. "I don't need your help." He reframed the directive. "This isn't help. It's a logistical imperative. Get in the car." The impulse to resist, to articulate her 8 months of self-reliance, was overridden by biology. Another contraction, the tremble in her legs, the sheer weight of exhaustion. Her capacity for pride had been eroded by fatigue. A small, resigned nod was her only reply as she entered the waiting vehicle. The car door closed, sealing them in, and the sedan merged with the night. The silence within the cabin became a dense, suffocating medium. Meadow retreated to the furthest corner of the seat, a protective arm encircling her belly as her gaze fixed on the world outside. Manhattan's architecture blurred into an abstract expression of light and shadow, a landscape observed but not perceived. Cale occupied the space less than 2 feet from her. Yet the gap separating them felt oceanic. He observed her not directly, but as a spectral image in the window's reflection, a portrait of sorrow. He noted every subtle flinch, the rhythmic clenching of her hand over her womb, a posture of defense maintained even within the vehicle's warmth. Sterling, at the wheel, was the archetype of professional detachment. navigating the road with absolute focus. He understood the unspoken protocols of his employer. The oppressive silence was finally pierced by Meadows' quiet instruction. 472 Willis Avenue, the Bronx. In the rearview mirror, Sterling's eyes met Cale's. The address required no map. Willis Avenue signified the borough's most neglected quadrant. It was a destination logic would advise against, particularly for a woman in her condition. Cale, however, remained a statue of impassivity. He offered no inquiry into her circumstances, no comment on the implicit danger. The only reaction was a tightening of his jaw, a visible tension in his temples as his reflection seemed to darken. The profound quiet reclaimed the space. Bridge lights slid over them, silent, linear beams in the dark. Meadow fought against the tide of exhaustion, a battle her body refused to wage. The confluence of her pregnancy, hours of labor, the trauma of her dismissal, and the shock of this reunion proved overwhelming. The weight on her eyelids became immense, her head beginning to list. Her respiration found a steady rhythm, and consciousness yielded. This was the first moment Cale permitted himself a direct gaze, beyond the mediation of the glass. He observed Meadow in the vulnerability of sleep, one hand a guardian over her child, the other surrendered to gravity. Sleep softened the lines of immediate stress, but the topography of the past 8 months remained etched on her face. The evidence of hardship was clear, the hollows beneath her eyes, the gauntness of her features, the worn state of her shoes, and hands coarsened by labor, a stark contrast to their past. The thought arrived not as a question, but as an electric certainty. His child. As he watched her, a subtle fracture appeared in the emotional barricade he had so carefully constructed. He leaned forward, his voice a low command meant only for Sterling. "Take us home." Sterling's nod was one of silent compliance. The vehicle altered its trajectory seamlessly, abandoning the Bronx for the insulated affluence of Upper Manhattan. 30 minutes hence, the car came to a halt before the formidable iron gates of the Thornton estate. The vehicle's passage was anticipated, the gates parting with silent efficiency. Their path was a long, stone-paved artery flanked by ancient oaks and illuminated lawns. At its terminus stood the mansion itself, a sprawling edifice of white stone and glass, its 3 stories glowing with palatial light. The car stopped. Sterling opened her door. A light touch from Cale on her shoulder shattered her sleep. Disorientation gave way to astonishment as her eyes registered the scene beyond the window. This was not the grit of Willis Avenue, but the curated perfection of an architectural magazine. Her head turned sharply towards Cale, a protest forming on her lips. The sheer scale of her fatigue, however, silenced it. His voice, a calm, declarative statement, left no room for debate. "Come on, you need to rest." He guided her into an entrance hall that dwarfed her apartment and into a ground-floor guest suite. Staff materialized with offerings of clean clothes, warm linens, and sustenance. Meadow moved through these rituals with the detached motion of an automaton. The contrast was stark. 8 months prior, she had fled a small flat with meager resources. Now she stood in the sanctuary of a powerful, dangerous man carrying a secret. The impulse to speak, to explain, to atone, was present but inert. The moment her body met the mattress, a surface of impossible softness, consciousness was extinguished. Sleep came as a complete cessation of being. After midnight, a profound stillness, long absent, settled over the Thornton estate. The household staff had receded into the architecture. The home's soundscape was reduced to the metronomic ticking of a hall clock and the whisper of wind against glass. On the second floor, within a cavernous study, Cale sat in solitude. The room featured towering ceilings and a glass wall that framed the panorama of Manhattan, A monolithic black oak desk dominated the space, its surface an orderly landscape of contracts and communication devices. The surrounding shelves housed a curated collection of literature, symbols of corporate victory, and philanthropic accolades, the artifacts of a carefully constructed public persona. Yet Cale's gaze was fixed elsewhere, drawn to the bottom right drawer of his desk. It was a space he had consciously avoided for months, a Pandora's box of memory and pain. Tonight, that resolve failed. He opened it with a slow, deliberate pull, revealing a small black velvet box beneath a file. He lifted the box and unfastened the lid. Within lay a simple band of silver, unadorned by jewels. It represented the absolute limit of his wealth at a time when he possessed nothing else. This was the very ring he had placed on Meadows' finger in a quiet ceremony at Brooklyn City Hall. The ring, an object of trivial mass, carried the immense weight of recollection, the nervous tremor of her hand as he offered it. Beside its case lay a worn photograph, a captured moment before a Brooklyn bookshop, where Meadows' unbridled happiness radiated as she leaned against him, clutching a forgotten novel. The image preserved a version of Cale capable of a genuine smile, a facial expression his current anatomy could no longer replicate. Setting the photo aside, he tilted his head back, his gaze lost on the ceiling. Over the last 12 months, he had resurrected an empire from its ashes, doubling the Thornton enterprise his father had built. Capital flowed ceaselessly. His dominion stretched from New York to Miami. Vassals sought his favor while adversaries vanished. Objectively, his victory was absolute. Yet in the nocturnal stillness, with the simple silver band in hand, Cale confronted the reality he had evaded for 8 months. The vacuum of her absence remained unfillable. Neither influence, nor wealth, nor Priscilla, nor the empire itself could occupy the space. Nothing. Setting the ring aside, he summoned Sterling via intercom. 2 minutes passed before a soft rap on the door. Enter. Sterling entered, securing the door behind him, his posture rigid and his expression a cipher, betrayed only by the acuity in his eyes. It was the gaze of an observer who understood a critical scene was imminent. Cale offered no courtesies, no chair, no refreshment, proceeding directly to the interrogation. How long? The question required no context for Sterling, he understood. Since the 3rd month following her departure. Cale's mandible clenched with audible force. 5 months. For 5 entire months, Sterling had possessed knowledge of Meadows' location and withheld it. Explain. Sterling met Cale's stare without a flicker of evasion. Because you were beginning to recover, you had reintegrated with the family, the empire was expanding. The alliance with Priscilla was progressing. All variables were aligning correctly. He paused. Informing you of her whereabouts would have prompted you to sacrifice everything once more. And this time, your return was not a certainty. Cale's hand tightened on the desk, his knuckles bleached of color. The impulse was to upend the furniture, to seize the man who had been his confidant for 12 years and erupt at him for usurping his agency. Yet he remained still, for the true torment was not the deception, but the chilling calculus behind it. He despised the logic, yet he understood it. Anything else? Cale's voice was a guttural threat. Sterling's composure wavered. I was aware of the pregnancy for approximately 5 months. The room's temperature seemed to plummet. Cale's gaze became lethal, a precursor to imminent violence. You were aware she was carrying a child, and you maintained your silence. Sterling held his ground. I lacked certainty of your paternity. But you suspected. The statement was an indictment, not an inquiry. The ensuing silence was an answer in itself, a confession Cale accepted. He rose with deliberation, the chair protesting with a mournful scrape against the floor. The two figures stood in opposition. 12 years. For 12 years, Sterling had been his most trusted instrument, the singular constant in his life, the sole individual Cale had ever fully trusted in a world where trust was a fatal vulnerability. Remove yourself from my presence, but maintain constant surveillance. If any harm befalls her or the child due to another failure on your part, 1. Your 12 years of service will offer no protection from my retribution. Leave. Sterling offered a curt, singular nod, his expression pale yet resolute. He pivoted and exited into the corridor. And for the first time in a dozen years, the closing door sealed away not a trusted subordinate, but a debtor whose currency was now inextricably tied to Meadow's well-being. He remained in the study, his focus fixed upon the silver ring. At last he seized it, securing it within his jacket's inner pocket before entering the hall. An instinctual path led him down to the ground-floor sitting room where Meadow rested. He breached the door in silence and slipped across the threshold. The space was dim, illuminated only by the gentle diffusion of a single lamp. Meadow was asleep on her side, one hand cushioning her head, the other protectively shielding her abdomen. Her respiration was even and deep, a portrait of serenity Cale hadn't witnessed in the turbulent months preceding her disappearance. He stood above her, a silent sentinel. An abrupt movement stirred beneath the blanket. A small internal kick caused the fabric to ripple. Cale's breath caught in his chest. He lowered himself onto the bed's edge without a sound. He extended a hand, the tremor in his fingers almost imperceptible, and laid his palm against her stomach. The child kicked once more, directly into his hand, a stronger, more defined presence, as if acknowledging him. Cale held his hand firm, barely breathing, sensing the nascent life beneath her skin. His daughter. No test or evidence was necessary. He possessed a certainty that defied all logic. This was his child. Meadow shifted in her sleep, but remained unconscious. Cale retracted his hand, rose to his feet, and turned toward the door. Before retreating into the hallway, he cast a final glance in her direction. In that profound quiet, a resolve crystallized within him, as solid and immutable as steel. He would not lose her a second time. Meadow regained consciousness as the first rays of dawn pierced the drapes. She remained still for a moment, her gaze tracing the high ceiling as she tried to orient herself. The mattress was unnaturally plush. The room's scale was immense. The air was pure, lacking the familiar dampness of her Bronx apartment. Then the tumult of the previous night returned, and with it, clarity. She was on the Thornton estate, within Cale's home. She rose with caution, one hand bracing the weight of her pregnancy, and noticed a change of comfortable clothing arranged on a nearby table. After dressing and washing her face in the adjoining bathroom, she emerged to find a staff member waiting with a tray. It held fresh fruit, toast, eggs, juice, and warm milk. Meadow simply looked at the meal, a knot tightening in her throat. For months, her breakfast had consisted of stale bread and water. She consumed the food deliberately, each mouthful accompanied by a piercing sense of incongruous shame. She had just set down her glass when a knock sounded at the door. The knock was subdued, yet decisive. She identified the visitor before the door moved. Cale entered, having exchanged his formal wear for a black shirt and dark trousers, sleeves rolled to the forearm. His expression was a carefully constructed void, though his eyes betrayed a sleepless night. He positioned a chair to face her, a small table their only barrier. The quiet in the room was a tangible pressure. He then broke it, his tone devoid of anger or warmth, purely transactional. Last night you claimed the child is not mine. A cold wave washed over Meadow. She maintained a neutral facade. That is correct. Cale inclined his head slightly, fixing her with a gaze she recalled with dread. It was the expression he employed to deconstruct a person, searching for a microscopic fissure in a fabrication to extract the truth. Sterling has had you under surveillance for the past 5 months. The color fled from Meadow's face, her skin growing cold. He knew your location, your activities, your associates. Cale's voice was like an inexorable engine. During those 5 months, you met with no one, no other men, no new relationships. There was only you, your work, and your expanding abdomen. Meadow's hands began to tremble. She concealed them beneath the table, her fingers twisting the material of her pants. A stinging sensation filled her eyes, but she suppressed the tears, defending the emotional fortress she had constructed over 8 months. Cale inclined forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his stare unyielding as a steel trap. The room seemed to contract, depriving Meadow of oxygen. I will pose the question once more. Who is the father? His voice deepened, gaining intensity, each syllable landing with immense gravity. For 8 months she had borne this secret in complete isolation. She had endured countless nights of solitary grief, only to compose herself for the dawn. She had studied sonograms, murmuring assurances to the unborn child. She had convinced herself that leaving Cale was the only viable path, that she could not detonate the new life he was building. But now, imprisoned by the same gaze she once greeted each morning, the entire performance disintegrated. Her composure fractured, then shattered entirely. Tears traced paths down her face. Yours. The word was a faint exhalation, yet it struck Cale with more impact than any physical assault he had ever sustained. He recoiled in his seat, the oxygen in the room seeming to vanish. His hands, resting at the chair's arms, started to tremble, a phenomenon he hadn't experienced in years. The very hands that remained steady in mortal combat now shook in response to her single word. A daughter. He was to be the father of a daughter. A child who had developed for 8 months beyond his awareness. 8 months during which Meadow had borne the burden alone, attended appointments alone, and faced an uncertain future alone. A profound silence expanded between them. Meadow daubed at her tears, her breathing ragged. I was not aware of the pregnancy when I left, she managed to say, her voice fracturing. I discovered it weeks later. By then you had rejoined your family. The empire was secure. I saw reports of you with Priscilla. Powerful, triumphant. You had finally attained the life you were destined for. She swallowed with difficulty. I could not pull you back into my chaos. Cale absorbed her words, and each one felt like a blade twisting between his ribs. The pain stemmed not from the validity of her rationale, but from her conviction in it. She genuinely believed that her disappearance, the concealment of his child, and her 8 months of solitary suffering constituted an act of benevolence. Model. Her misguided sacrifice wounded him more profoundly than any betrayal. You took that choice from me, he stated, his voice strained with rage. You chose to leave. You chose to hide our daughter. You chose to keep me in ignorance. Meadow's head sank, her tears falling upon her stomach. I was terrified. Terrified of what? That you would despise me. Her words acted as a release valve, and the fury drained from Cale's chest. He truly saw her then, the tears and the hand on her belly, and his anger dissolved. A deeper, more corrosive pain surfaced. And then the child moved. The kick was sharp and definite, making Meadow gasp and press her hand to the place. Cale watched the small ripple shift beneath the fabric. His daughter, alive, a tangible presence. He stood, crossed the bed, and sat beside her, so near she could feel the warmth of his breath. When he spoke, the rage was gone, replaced by a deep and unbreakable resolve. You will not face this by yourself any longer. That afternoon, Cale led Meadow into the garden behind the mansion, a vast, immaculate space enclosed by towering green hedges, a marble fountain murmuring at its center. The October sun held just enough warmth to banish the last of the evening's chill. A soft breeze stirred the oaks, scattering a few yellow leaves across the lawn. They settled on a stone bench by the fountain, letting the sound of water occupy the space between them. Yet this was not a tense quietude. It lacked the anxious, questioning silence of the bus stop, heavy with deception. Nor was it the morning silence, shattered by revelations and sorrow. This was a stillness shared between two people whose connection had once been their entire world. They existed in a shared silence where words were no longer necessary to bridge the chasm. For the first time in 8 months, the space between them was clear. No deception, no concealments, only Cale, Meadow, and the nascent life she carried. She observed the garden, inhaled deeply, and felt the weight of that time begin to dissolve. Then, without a word, she guided his hand, resting his palm flat against her stomach. Cale remained perfectly still, allowing her to lead. His hand's warmth permeated the fabric. Beneath it, a faint flutter, then a distinct kick, striking the center of his palm. He had stolen a similar moment while she slept, feeling an intruder's guilt. This was different. This was a formal invitation. Her eyes held his as she admitted him to the world she had guarded alone for 8 months. Cale's eyes widened, his lips parted, but he was speechless. The hand that had authorized violence and ended lives now rested upon the woman he loved. His daughter kicked once more, with greater force, as if communicating directly with him. Cale swallowed, his eyes suddenly glistening. He did not blink or turn away, allowing his vulnerability to show. Observing him, Meadow smiled, her first genuine smile since her return. It was not feigned or mournful, but a gentle, warm expression that transported him to a Brooklyn bookstore from long ago. She's quite active, Meadow murmured. Cale cleared his throat, his voice rough. She takes after her mother. A small laugh escaped Meadow, blending with the fountain's melody. In that fleeting moment within the quiet garden of the Thornton estate, a fragile sense of peace settled. The previous 8 months of anguish seemed to vanish, but tranquility is a transient guest in Cale Thornton's life, and a tempest was already gathering on the horizon. Priscilla Hargrove had been aware of Meadow's presence long before the scene in the garden. Her information came from a night guard, a Hargrove agent embedded within the estate's security since the engagement was reinstated. A concise message arrived at dawn, detailing everything. Thornton has arrived with a pregnant woman. They are in the first-floor sitting room. Priscilla read the text, then immediately called her father. Raymond Hargrove listened patiently, allowing the silence to stretch after she had explained the situation. His tone was unnervingly placid, as if discussing the weather. Her name? Meadow Sinclair, Cale's former partner. She is pregnant. The child was of no consequence to Raymond. The true crisis was that Cale Thornton, his daughter's fiancé, had brought his expectant ex-lover home on their engagement night. Raymond understood the implications immediately. Should this engagement collapse, the entire Thornton-Hargrove alliance would crumble with it. Years of agreements and pacts would become void, leaving a power vacuum that their rivals would eagerly exploit. A war between families would erupt. Lives would be lost. This was a matter of survival, not his daughter's emotional state. "I will manage this," Raymond said, and ended the call. Cale later had to attend a mandatory downtown meeting. His absence would raise suspicion, and suspicion was a fatal liability in their world. Sterling, as usual, went with him. For Meadows' protection, Cale ordered the estate locked down, completely unaware that some of his men were loyal to another employer. 30 minutes after Cale's vehicle departed, a second black sedan approached the front gate. 2 men in sharp suits emerged, their shoes polished, every hair in place. They displayed no weapons, nothing that would trigger an alarm. They projected the image of corporate negotiators, the kind security admits without question, particularly when a guard has already authorized their visit. Meadow was attempting to read when an attendant informed her she had visitors. Entering the hall, she saw the 2 suited men in the foyer. The one in front offered a polite nod and a humorless smile. "Miss Sinclair." It was a summons directly from Raymond Hargrove. "Just a brief conversation," they insisted. A chill ran through Meadow. Though she'd never met him, his name was a specter in her life. Priscilla's father, the Southern kingpin Cale, was meant to pacify with this marriage. "I don't believe that is wise," she faltered, but the man's artificial smile remained fixed. "Mr. Hargrove is considerate of your time. Only a few moments. The car is here." Meadows' gaze flickered between the 2 men and the nearby estate guard. The guard, her supposed protector, stood like a statue. In that instant, she understood this was not a request. Refusal was not a viable option. She could create a disturbance, attempt to phone Cale, perhaps even run. But at 8 months pregnant with compromised security, her position was hopeless. The men before her were civil, but their eyes held the coldness of steel. Meadow forced down the fear rising within her. She took her coat and entered the vehicle. The sedan glided away from the estate, a phantom moving through Upper Manhattan toward Midtown. Positioned between the 2 enforcers, the baby felt immensely heavy. The air grew dense, and a cold dread began to coil in her stomach. She did not know their destination, Raymond's intentions, or if she would ever return. But then, a faint kick from within, directly beneath her hand. Meadows' thoughts returned to the garden that afternoon, to the solid, reassuring pressure of Cale's touch. She recalled the sheer wonder in his eyes as the baby stirred, the unguarded emotion in his voice as he whispered, "She is exactly like her mother." Meadow inhaled slowly, pressing a hand to her stomach for courage. The car halted before a midtown brownstone, unmarked, unguarded, with only a massive oak door. A passerby might mistake it for a law office or an exclusive private club. They would be partially correct, except its members settled disputes without legal counsel. She was escorted inside, down a dim corridor, past a vacant bar, scented with old cigars and leather, and toward a private room. The door opened into a space far smaller than she had imagined. A desk, 2 chairs, a single lamp, and drawn curtains. Seated behind the desk was Raymond Hargrove, 62 years old, with silver hair, a severe face, and eyes like sharpened blades. He wore a gray 3-piece suit, minus the tie, appearing less like a crime lord and more like a chief executive officer after a grueling negotiation. He made no move to stand. His cold, gray-blue gaze simply swept over her, taking her measure from head to toe. His eyes noted her pale face, her swollen abdomen, her simple shoes, and the hand held protectively over her child. He gestured toward the chair. "Please sit, Miss Sinclair." Meadow complied, not from deference, but because her legs threatened to buckle. Raymond observed her for a moment, his voice calm and utterly frigid as it cut the silence. It was the tone of a man finalizing a transaction. "I hold no personal animosity toward you, Miss Sinclair. You are merely a young woman who chose the wrong man at an inopportune time." Meadow remained silent. "However," Raymond went on, "you represent a significant complication, and I doubt you grasp its magnitude." He leaned forward, placing his elbows on the desk. "This arrangement between my daughter and Cale is not about affection. It is a business contract. It concerns territory, influence, and revenue. This marriage preserves stability. If it fails, it leaves a power vacuum, and a vacuum, Miss Sinclair, is invariably filled with blood." He uttered the word blood with clinical detachment. "Violating this pact means war, a conflict with a very real body count. Not 1 or 2 casualties, we are speaking of dozens." The air felt as if it had been forced from Meadow's lungs. Her hand clenched on her belly. Raymond registered her reaction, then produced a thick envelope from a drawer and placed it on the desk. $200,000 in cash. He slid it toward her. "California, Texas, or Europe. The choice is yours." He leaned back, his confidence absolute. "The terms are straightforward. You disappear from New York this evening, and you will never make contact with Cale Thornton again." The silence in the room was absolute. Meadow stared at the envelope, a sum of money larger than any she had ever seen. It was a gilded cage presented as a key, a fresh beginning, a sanctuary, all for the unborn child, an exit from serving drinks in her 3rd trimester. Her focus drifted from the currency to Raymond and finally to her own swollen form. And a core of resolve, forged in the crucible of her ordeal, began to calcify into something unbreakable. And with that new spine of steel, she rose. Meadow shifted her chair back, standing with the slow, deliberate weight of her pregnancy. Her gaze fixed upon Raymond Hargrove. "I have managed for 8 months alone, Mr. Hargrove." Her voice was a placid sea, devoid of the tremors that had defined her for so long. Pregnant, cleaning floors, waiting tables, barricading a broken door with a chair to sleep. Your money is not a prerequisite for my survival. I have already survived. A minuscule twitch in Raymond's brow appeared, the faintest crack in his stoic facade, but a crack nonetheless. He was a man unaccustomed to refusal, particularly from a slight 27-year-old woman in borrowed clothes. Meadow pressed on. "And my daughter is not a commodity for which you can assign a $200,000 valuation." The emphasis on "my daughter" was an act of finality. Raymond simply observed her. There was no anger, not even surprise. It was the expression of a man whose 62 years taught him that courage is often a precursor to tragedy. "You are a courageous woman, Miss Sinclair," he stated, his voice flat, "but courage makes for a poor shield." It was not a menace. It was a cold, empirical observation. A tremor of fear traced its way down Meadow's back, yet her posture remained defiant. "I would like to go home." Raymond appraised her for another moment before offering a slow, measured nod. "Return her." The men opened the door, and Meadow exited, her back a rigid line until she was beyond his sight. The instant she was concealed, a tremor began in her hands. Raymond remained alone, his gaze on the rejected money. The woman had refused. He rotated the ring on his finger, his features hardening to stone. The entire situation had just escalated in complexity. The black sedan did not return her to the estate. It stopped at a street corner 4 blocks distant in a quiet neighborhood. The driver offered a thin, insincere smile. "You can make your way from here, Miss Sinclair." The implication was unmistakable. The vehicle would not appear on any security footage. It was a sterile transaction, a liability contained. The entire maneuver was a signature of Raymond Hargrove's methods. Meadow stepped onto the pavement. The door thudded shut, the car dissolving into the flow of traffic. The night air had grown colder, a bitter wind that pierced the fabric of her coat. 4 blocks, a walk of 7, perhaps 8 minutes under normal circumstances. But at 8 months pregnant, with aching limbs and a body pushed to its limit, each footfall was an ordeal. She was merely halfway down the block when the first contraction seized her, and it was unlike any before. This was a crushing, vice-like pressure, as if her entire uterus were being warped by a band of steel. Meadow stopped, fighting for breath while clinging to a railing for support. She attempted to rationalize it as a product of stress, a phenomenon that would subside. Releasing the railing, she forced herself onward. She took 10 steps before the next wave engulfed her, its intensity eclipsing the first. The pain bent her in half, her arms instinctively wrapping her belly as a scream was strangled in her throat. It was a searing fire, radiating from her core to her spine. We find our subject then, clinging to a lamppost, gasping in the frigid night, a sheen of cold sweat on her skin. It is then she feels it, a warm flow that becomes a sudden gush, drenching her clothes and pooling in her shoes. Her water had just broken. Meadow looked down in stark disbelief as 9 months of suppressed panic finally detonated. The birth was imminent. On a frozen sidewalk in the deep of night, the baby's arrival was at hand. She fumbled for her phone, attempting to locate the nearest hospital. Her hands were slick with perspiration, rendering the screen unresponsive. As she tried to dial, another contraction struck like a physical blow, sending the phone clattering to the concrete. Meadow collapsed onto the pavement, her back against the lamppost, a primal instinct causing her to shield her abdomen. Each breath was a ragged, painful precursor to the agony tearing her apart from within. She scanned the desolate street. A few pedestrians glanced her way before averting their eyes and continuing on. No one intervened. She was utterly alone, alone with her agony and a child fighting its way into a harsh Manhattan night. But she was not, in fact, unobserved. 3 cars behind, Sterling had witnessed the entire catastrophic sequence. The moment Raymond's enforcers arrived, he had identified them, not from a file, but from an intimate knowledge of every operative in the Hargrove syndicate. It was an essential function of his position. He could not intervene while Cale was occupied in a meeting. His duty was to remain at his principal's side. Instead, he dispatched one of his own men to follow at a discreet distance. Thus, as the sedan carrying Meadow departed, it was shadowed every block. Sterling knew she was taken to the Midtown Club. He knew she was inside for 40 minutes. He saw her emerge, her posture defiant, but her hands trembling uncontrollably. And when the car abandoned her 4 blocks from the estate, Sterling recognized this too, as part of the calculated script. He was receiving a live report when his operative's voice crackled. "She's down, on the sidewalk. Condition appears critical." There is fluid on the pavement. Sterling was connected to Cale in under 3 seconds. Cale was mid-negotiation in a downtown boardroom, finalizing a multi-million-dollar accord. His phone vibrated. He recognized the caller. "Sterling?" He answered, "Meadow. She is in labor, 84th and Madison." Before his subordinate could finish his report, Cale was already moving, his chair falling to the floor behind him. There were no farewells, no excuses, not even a backward glance. He stormed from the room, down the corridor, into the elevator, and into the extraction vehicle already waiting at the curb. 84th and Madison, accelerate! The car shot into the night like a projectile. In the back seat, Cale did something alien to his entire adult existence. He began to pray, not to a specific deity, but repeating a single mantra. She must be all right. The baby must be all right. Let her be okay. 7 minutes later, the car skidded to a stop. Cale was out before the engine cut off, and then he saw her. There was Meadow, collapsed against a lamppost, her face a mask of pallor. Sweat plastered her hair to her skin as she clutched her abdomen, her mouth agape, pulling in desperate, shallow breaths. He ran, sliding to his knees before her. Meadow. Her eyes, clouded with pain, finally focused on his. I'm so scared. Cale slid one arm beneath her back, the other under her legs, and lifted her as if she weighed nothing. Her startling lack of weight sent a sharp pang through his own chest. She clung to his shirt, her head dropping to his shoulder as another contraction convulsed through her, a scream tearing from her beside his ear. I have you, he growled, his voice a pillar of strength, even as his own world was collapsing. I have you, he repeated, settling her into the waiting vehicle. They raced to the hospital as the contractions intensified, their frequency and ferocity increasing with each passing moment. Meadow was crushing his hand with every new wave of pain, but Cale's grip remained just as firm. The hand of a Mafia Don was trembling for the first time, not for his own fate, but for the woman he loved and the child he had yet to meet. The car screeched to the Mount Sinai emergency entrance, its tires protesting on the damp asphalt. Cale was already lifting Meadow out before Sterling could fully open the door. She was still latched to his shirt, her face ashen, her hair soaked with sweat. The contractions now arriving in a relentless, unbroken chain. A medical team descended with a gurney. Cale placed her down with care, but her hand remained locked on his shirt. Don't leave me. I am not going anywhere. They raced her through sterile, fluorescent corridors, bursting through double doors into the maternity ward. The attending physician made a swift assessment, confirming what Cale's intuition was already screaming. She was in advanced labor. The child's arrival was not just imminent, it was past due. They rushed Meadow into a delivery room, a sterile, white chamber heavy with the scent of antiseptic, a monitor beeping a steady, rhythmic pulse. The nursing staff moved with practiced efficiency. The doctor assumed his position with calm authority while Cale stood by Meadow, her grip turning his knuckles white. The subsequent contraction struck her like a physical blow, and a scream was ripped from Meadow, not muffled as before. This was a raw, primal expression of absolute torturous pain. Her body contorted, her face twisting as tears streamed down her cheeks. I can't do this, she choked out between the waves, her voice shattering. I can't. Cale moved closer, his voice, a tool known to the underworld only as a command or a condemnation, became softer than he had ever known. You are the strongest woman I have ever known, Meadow. You survived for 8 months on your own. You stood against Raymond Hargrove. You possess more strength than any person I have ever encountered in my life, and you will get through this. Do you understand me? You will do this. Meadow looked up, her sight blurred by tears. Her warm brown eyes met his cold gray ones, and there, in that clinical space, amidst the agony. She found something in his expression to which she could cling. The doctor interjected. On the next one, I need you to push. Push with all your strength. Meadow simply nodded, her hand clenching Kale's with the force of forged steel. The contraction seized her. She bore down with a cry, then pushed once more. Her body arched from the bed, the tendons in her neck stark against her damp skin. Kale held her fast, his gaze locked on hers, unmoving as her screams pierced his very core. That's it. Continue. I can see the head, the doctor announced. Meadow gave a final push, the agony so profound it felt like she was being torn apart. She crushed Kale's hand with a pressure that should have splintered bone, but he showed no reaction. One last time. The final one. Meadow drew a ragged breath, met Kale's eyes, and pushed with every ounce of her being, with all her solitude, her terror, and her devotion to this child. And then a cry tore through the air, small but undeniably powerful, sharp and alive. The tension in the room, a palpable force, shattered at that sound. The first declaration of a new existence. Meadow collapsed against the pillows, utterly spent, her chest heaving as tears coursed down her cheeks. A baby girl, the doctor stated, and she is healthy. A nurse gently cleaned the infant, wrapped her in a pink blanket, and placed her in Meadow's arms. She gazed at the tiny crimson face, still contorted and new. The baby's eyes were sealed shut, her mouth agape, her small fingers clutching the fabric. Meadow's own tears began to fall, marking the cloth that swaddled her daughter. She is perfect, she whispered, her voice fractured by exhaustion and a joy she had believed was lost to her forever. Kale stood above them, a silent witness. In his world, he had seen both the magnificent and the monstrous, but nothing had ever resembled this. The baby's eyes fluttered open. She could not truly see, of course. Her irises held that opaque, newborn blue-gray, yet they seemed to fix directly on him. Then a miniature hand rose, and a few tiny fingers located and encircled Kale's trigger finger. That finger had ended lives, authorized death warrants, and remained steady in negotiations for empires. But in this moment, it was shaking. It trembled, held captive by a newborn girl weighing less than 3 kilograms. And that simple, innocent contact was more potent than any power he had ever wielded. Tears welled in Kale's eyes. He did not fight them, did not wipe them away, did not conceal them. For the first time since Meadow had left him, genuine tears spilled over, tracing a path down his face and onto his sleeve. Winslow, Meadow said softly, her voice weary yet content, her gaze fixed on their daughter. I wish to name her Winslow. Kale looked from the infant to Meadow, and then he smiled. It was a genuine smile, not a tool of business or intimidation. It was a smile his entire East Coast operation had never once witnessed. The smile from the old Brooklyn bookstore, it had reappeared on Meadow's face, right here in this delivery room. The infant Winslow has arrived, swaddled and serene. And for a moment, Meadow's expression reflects pure tranquility. Kale is absorbed in fatherhood, completely lost in this new reality. And then the door is thrown wide open. Kale's instincts immediately shift him into a protective stance, but the intrusion is not an enemy. It is his own father, Brantley Thornton. This man represents an older, colder version of Kale himself. Their eyes meet. It has been 2 full years. Their final conversation ended with, "You are dead to me." Consequently, Kale positions himself as a barrier between Brantley and the child. But Brantley's attention bypasses his son and Meadow entirely. He moves directly toward the bassinet. Kale prepares for a confrontation. The room becomes utterly silent. Then Brantley, with the same hand that constructed a violent empire, reaches out, And remarkably, the killer's hand is unsteady. The stoic Don trembles at the presence of his granddaughter. At that moment, the baby stirs. Her infant eyes fix upon his. One can almost see the internal battle as Brantley suppresses a wave of profound emotion. He turns to Meadow, the woman he despises. She meets his gaze without fear. He grunts. "She resembles you." Then he confronts Cale with an intense, authoritative stare. Hargrove is going to retaliate. Cale simply replies, "I am aware." The entire atmosphere transforms. They are no longer adversaries, but strategists preparing for war. Brantley gives a sharp nod. "Then we make preparations." It is not an apology, not even close, but that one word, "we," signifies that he has chosen a side in the coming conflict. "We" signals the reformation of the Thornton Alliance. Cale will not face this war in isolation. Brantley gives a final look and then departs. Meadow exhales, releasing a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. And for an instant, Cale's hardened facade cracks, revealing a glimmer of hope. The following morning presents a tableau of maternal peace. Winslow sleeps on her mother's chest. The scene appears flawless. But this tranquility is a fragile illusion. Elsewhere, Raymond Hargrove and Priscilla are consumed by fury, already plotting their retribution. The cancellation of the engagement has effectively declared a war between their syndicates, and Meadow carries the weight of its cause. Cale has not slept. He has maintained a vigil over them through the night. Finally, Meadow, her voice tired but firm, breaks the stillness. "I must leave Cale before this escalates." He displays no anger, only sorrow. "You attempted that 8 months ago. What was the outcome?" She recalls her 8 months of fear and flight. Cale states the grim truth to her. "When you departed, I became a true monster. I had no regard for my own life or death in your absence." She struggles against tears, attempting to remain stoic, but he continues. He produces a worn velvet box, an artifact she had presumed was lost forever. Inside rests a simple, slender silver ring. It was an inexpensive ring from a time when he was disowned and possessed nothing. The sight of it undoes her. The tears finally break free. "You kept this," she whispers. "Always," he confirms. "I never once forgot." At this, she dissolves into unrestrained sobbing. All the anguish of the past 8 months erupts from her. Cale moves to the bed beside her and takes her hand. He holds her hand firmly. "A war is imminent, but I would choose war with you over peace without you. Meadow Sinclair, become my wife once more." Her gaze shifts from the ring to him, to their child. A single word closes the distance. Yes. This time, however, the act was freighted with the knowledge of what was at stake. Meadow gazed at the ring, a tearful smile forming. He met her eyes, glanced at their daughter, and then vowed, "This time, no force will separate us." Outside, the morning sun illuminated Manhattan. The city was beginning its day, its millions of inhabitants entirely unaware. They could not know that on the 5th floor of Mount Sione, a fractured family was attempting to reassemble itself. Meanwhile, in a nightclub, Raymond Hargrove was already devising his vengeance. From her penthouse, Priscilla looked down upon the city, consumed by rage and humiliation, swearing this was not the end. A conflict was brewing. But in that hushed hospital room, Cale Thornton's entire universe had condensed to Meadow Sinclair and their daughter, Winslow, asleep in her mother's arms. After being so long without an anchor, he finally felt a sense of belonging. Not in a mansion or an empire, but there, with them. Their narrative had not concluded. It was merely paused, awaiting a second act, and this time they would not retreat. You see, life is rarely so straightforward. At times, to love another requires one to stand in opposition to the entire world. At times, the greatest sacrifice is not leaving, but remaining to face the tempest. And sometimes true courage is not found in holding a weapon, but in allowing entry to a heart that one has already broken. Meadow demonstrated this. She proved that authentic strength is not derived from power or wealth, but from the will to face each day alone with a new life and persevere. And Kale taught us that regardless of what one becomes, there remains a sanctuary where the mask can finally be removed. The true sanctuary is not a place, but a person, the locus where one's spirit finds its center. This narrative's resonance speaks to that fundamental truth. The dilemmas of love often demand sacrifices that test our very essence. Share your reflections on such profound choices in the discussion below. To affirm that love's power transcends sovereign rule, your engagement serves as a testament. This analysis is for those who grasp that love's pursuit necessitates conflict. To continue these explorations of the human condition, consider joining our community of inquiry by subscribing. Our examination of these complex narratives will continue. For all who contemplate these themes, may you find clarity, tranquility, and a spirit enriched by profound connection. Thank you for joining this discourse. We will resume our analysis in the subsequent essay.